Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Binder. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Climate Change, Air Resources, and Energy here at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Welcome to what is the fifth episode in our series here. So it's the fifth session where we're having a series of webinars throughout June regarding the development of New York State's economy-wide Cap and Invest program. For today's webinar, we will be covering again some of the same information that we have covered in the first several webinars. But today we'll be focusing on the waste sector. That does mean we will be raising some of the same questions and topics that we're seeking input on, again, with a focus on addressing these issues from the perspective of waste. Our goal with these sessions is to stimulate thinking amongst stakeholders like all of you, and to describe these issues that we want to hear from you about as we design the program. We will be saving the questions for the end of the session, after the presentation portion of today's session. We won't necessarily have time to address all of your questions. These webinars are really just part of the extensive outreach that we are doing and that we plan to continue to do. We understand how important this program is for purposes of meeting the requirements of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and really just for the future of our state in general. Our focus throughout this series of webinars in June is to ensure that stakeholders of various backgrounds and perspectives are really well positioned to provide us with input on these specific topics. And that input can be provided through a website that we will be repeating throughout the course of today's presentation and session. And that website is capandinvest.ny.gov. We have budgeted up to 2 hours for today's webinar, but let's start by discussing the procedures. Ryan?
Thank you, John. I wanted to start by letting you all know that as an attendee, you will not be able to unmute or turn on your video. Attendees will, however, be able to submit questions via the Q&A feature. Select clarifying questions will be answered by panelists. If you are having tech issues and would like help, you can also submit a request via the Q&A feature. We will do our best to assist you. If you can't hear the presentation, you can configure your audio settings by clicking the arrow in the audio box. This will allow you to change the speaker settings. If you're having connectivity issues, you can also press switch audio to phone, and this will allow you to listen to the audio of the webinar through your phone. Today's webinar will also offer live captioning and translation services. You can turn on closed captioning for the presentation at the bottom of the screen. You can also change the language of the captions by pressing the Translation To setting. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the webinar recording will be posted on the New York State website at capandinvest.ny.gov. Turn it back to you, John. Next slide, please.
Thanks very much, Ryan, for walking us through the meeting procedures for today. And really, thanks to all of you for joining us. Just like with our previous webinars, if you've been with us for our previous episodes, we do have several staff members here today from both the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, as well as our partners from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA. We are eager to receive your input through that webpage that Ryan described, because we really are wanting to make sure we design these details right in terms of the details of the state's economy-wide Cap and Invest program, which is designed to meet the requirements of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. We'll refer to that throughout the course of today as the CLCPA or the Climate Act. Before we do get into some of the details of this program and some of the specific issues that we're seeking input on, we did think it was important to once again provide an overview of the process that we plan to follow for the development and implementation of this program. We do want to emphasize that this series of webinars is really just the beginning of this outreach process. We are relatively early in the process of designing the program, and so that's why the time is right now to get input from stakeholders like all of you. So I mentioned that we might not be able to get to all of your questions today, but we will also not necessarily have definitive answers to all of your questions. And really, that's intentional, that's purposeful. That's because at this stage in the design of the program, we have not made final decisions. We want to hear from all of you, from really all types of stakeholders before we finalize these program elements. Because we know it's most important to get the program right and to make sure that it's a successful program. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about how to follow this process. You can go to sign up to receive email alerts about upcoming events. You can sign up at the Climate Act mailing list. You'll receive notifications for additional meetings like this one. We also make webinar slide decks and recordings available on our website, capitninvest.ny.gov. Materials and recordings from many of the previous sessions are already available, and slides and the recording from this session will also be posted there. Comments can be submitted throughout the process via the website by clicking the submit comment buttons. And later on in the presentation at the end, Joe Berman from NYSERDA will provide some additional screenshots and explanation about how you actually can go ahead and submit those comments. But if you do have questions about that, please enter them into the Q&A feature as Ryan described, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation as well. Moving on to the next slide. We budgeted up to 2 hours for today's session. We might not take up all of that time. As part of today's session, we want to provide quickly a brief overview of the Climate Act and really the history, the background that led us to this point of developing an economy-wide cap and invest program to achieve the requirements of the law. Then we'll give a brief overview of what an economy-wide cap and invest program is and really what's different about New York's program, at least based on our current thinking, as compared to other similar programs in other jurisdictions. That includes the key concept of obligated and non-obligated sources. We will have some material throughout the presentation that further illustrates that distinction. Some of the presentation and questions today will be something of a repeat for those of you that have been with us for any of our previous webinars, but we do recognize that we might have some new participants today. After that overview and kind of the distinction between obligated and non-obligated emissions, we will get into the more detailed questions about various design elements of each of the 3 regulations that are under development to support the economy-wide cap and invest program. And we'll be thinking about how those questions are relevant for the focus topic of today's webinar, which again is waste. And then we will take some questions at the end, and then we'll conclude by discussing the next steps, including the timeline and opportunities for additional input going forward. So just as with our first 4 episodes in the series, we do have a lot of content to cover today. So that's why we will save our responses to questions for the end after the presentation portion of today's session. So again, though, I do want to reiterate that at this point in the regulatory process, we do not necessarily have specific answers to the particular question that you may be posing. That's because we want to hear your input before making any final decisions about what will be in the regulations. And again, when you want to provide that input, you can do so by going to that website, capitninvest.ny.gov. We'll be considering all of that input as we develop a draft proposal. So on the next slide, so we're here in large part because of the Climate Act, the CLCPA. That's a law that was passed back in 2019, became effective in 2020. And this law really sets the state on a path towards a carbon neutral economy. It mandates at least an 85% reduction in statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That's from 1990 levels of emissions. It also has a more near-term requirement of a 40% reduction by 2030. To help achieve these requirements, the CLCPA also directs that electricity in the state be 100% emissions-free by 2040, and that 70% of our electricity be in the form of renewable electricity by 2030. There's also some additional energy generation and storage requirements. And critical to the Climate Act are additional requirements with respect to climate justice and equity. These we will mention throughout today as well, because these are not just requirements of the law, they're also very important principles for us at DEC and NYSERDA as we design the details of this cap and invest program. Moving on to the next slide. So the Climate Act requires DEC to prepare an annual statewide greenhouse gas emissions report, or an inventory. This is a report that covers all greenhouse gas emission sources in the state, looking back from 1990 up through 2 years prior. And it includes emissions from sources within the state, as well as those that are associated with imported electricity and fossil fuels. So DEC issued our most recent annual report back in December of last year, December 2022, And that included emissions data from 1990 up through 2020. Of course, we all know that 2020 was not a typical year really for any of us, but due to the impacts of the COVID pandemic. So there's two graphs on this screen right now. The image on the left-hand side shows the economic sectors and the relative contribution of each of those sectors to statewide greenhouse gas emissions. So the orange wedge or slice kind of on the left portion of that comes from waste emissions, which is our focus for today's webinar. In the graph on the right, we highlight where we were back in 1990, where we were in 2019, and where we need to go to meet the emission limits that are set forth in the Climate Act. Now, I mentioned how those are the 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050 emission reduction requirements. Another requirement of the Climate Act was for DEC to adopt a regulation. We did that at the end of 2020. That's called Part 496. That regulation translated those percentage emission reduction requirements into requirements for millions of metric tons. So that's why those two right-hand side blue bars on the screen for 2030 and 2050, those are our emission limits statewide for 2030 and 2050. That equates to roughly 246 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and roughly 62 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for 2050. So those are the statewide emission limits that we are seeking to ensure that we will actually achieve through the implementation of this Cap and Invest program. Moving on to the next slide. Before we go back into some of the details of the program itself, we did want to again emphasize that the Climate Action Council recommended an economy-wide Cap and Invest program as the most cost-effective means of achieving the Climate Act's emission limits in the final scoping plan that was released at the end of 2022. This was after an extensive 3-year process for the council to develop a scoping plan that included lots of opportunities for public input. The final scoping plan, which is available on climate.ny.gov, contains a chapter addressing economy-wide strategies. That's chapter 17 of the final scoping plan. And I would encourage folks to go back and take a look at that chapter because it does provide helpful context, including some background and criteria for evaluation of various economy-wide strategies. That's what led to the council recommending a Cap and Invest program. The chapter 17 of the scoping plan also includes some proposed program design elements that serve as informative recommendations for us at DEC and NYSERDA, and for some starting points as we develop the details of this program. Consistent with those recommendations coming out of the scoping plan process, Governor Hochul directed DEC and NYSERDA to develop an economy-wide Cap and Invest program back at the beginning of this year in her 2023 State of the State address. And finally, the recently enacted state budget that was passed last month further advanced this program by creating the financial foundation that's necessary to support an economy-wide Cap and Invest program. Moving on to the next slide. So when the governor did announce that she was directing us at DEC and NYSERDA to implement this program, the governor also laid out for us several key principles. First among these was affordability. And that's why a portion of allowance proceeds that will come in as a result of this program will go directly back to New Yorkers to help address energy affordability. Another key principle laid out for us by Governor Hochul is investing in disadvantaged communities. The Climate Act contains a requirement that at least 35%, with the goal of 40% or more, of clean energy and energy efficiency investments benefit disadvantaged communities. So again, this will remain a key principle for us, along with other program features I'll discuss to help address climate justice. But in addition to affordability and climate justice, other key principles that are guiding our development of the program include climate leadership, which is really about facilitating the potential linkage with other programs and similar programs in other jurisdictions. Creating jobs and preserving economic competitiveness for the state, which is one of the key principles at issues for us, of course. And then funding a sustainable future through ambitious clean energy investments with portions of the Cap and Invest revenue that comes in. Moving on to the next slide, I do want to reiterate that really a primary purpose of this program is to ensure that the state actually achieves the statewide greenhouse gas emission limits that are set forth in the law. So the illustrative chart on the right-hand side of the screen shows how the maximum amount of annual greenhouse gas emissions in the state will decline each year. So we already know the endpoints for 2030 and 2050. That's the 40% by 2030 and the 85% by 2050 emission reduction requirements that are set forth in the Climate Act, and those millions of metric tons I mentioned for 2030 and 2050. So we know what those endpoints are for those years. But what we don't yet know is the precise starting point or the trajectory of that downward slope. That's one of the things that's still to be determined throughout this regulatory process, and that we're seeking your feedback on as we help to determine what that appropriate slope is for the state. Moving on to the next slide, which is a visual depiction of some of what I have just been describing. So first, this is a program that will set a legally enforceable limit on the annual amount of greenhouse gas emissions that can be emitted in the state of New York. That's the cap portion of the Cap and Invest program. Each year, this emissions cap will decline to reduce greenhouse gas emissions overall. But a second key feature of the program is going to be the legal requirement for large sources of greenhouse gas emissions to purchase or obtain emission allowances. Emission allowances are really limited authorizations to emit 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions. So large sources of emissions will be required to obtain an allowance to cover each ton of greenhouse gas emissions associated with their activities. So in order to comply with this regulatory program, at the end of a relevant time period, obligated sources will have to provide back to DEC emission allowances in a quantity to cover their associated emissions. Emission allowances that are surrendered or provided to DEC for compliance purposes are permanently retired, meaning they can never again be utilized by a source to cover a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. And because the overall amount of these emission allowances that are issued by the state is limited, capped, right? And because it declines each year, that's how we have the legal assurances that greenhouse gas emissions will in fact decrease to meet our statewide requirements as set forth in the law. And third, looking to that bottom right quadrant of this graphic, because most emission allowances will be sold by the state through auctions, that results in proceeds for the state. And these proceeds will be utilized for multiple purposes. The state budget that was passed last month, as I mentioned, that includes a roughly 1/3, 2/3 split in those proceeds. In other words, roughly 1/3 of the proceeds that come in as a result of this program will go directly back to New Yorkers to help address affordability. And roughly 2/3 of the proceeds that come in will go towards projects and actions that further reduce emissions. This 1/3, 2/3 split, if you will, was in the state budget that, again, passed last month. Another part of the budget that passed last month was calling for a climate affordability study process. This will look at the best mechanisms for getting that 1/3 of funds that will go directly back to New Yorkers. The climate affordability study process will provide recommendations for the most impactful use of that set of funds. The budget also created a climate investment account, which will direct the remaining funds, the 2/3, to support things that help to transition to a less carbon intensive economy. Other types of actions that are really consistent with recommendations coming out of the scoping plan. And finally, I want to reiterate that a key principle for us in designing this program is prioritizing frontline disadvantaged communities. We know that these communities have long suffered from pollution as a result of longstanding environmental injustice. And so we want to make sure that this program is designed in a manner that helps to further address these concerns and reduce emissions in these communities. Of course, this is a focus that's important for us as a requirement in the law, as well as a principle that we will continue to keep at the front of our minds with all details of the program. Moving on to the next slide. With that background of the program, I did want to highlight just a few items before I turn it over to some of our staff that are leading the development of the details of these regulations. First, while the state does issue an annual statewide greenhouse gas emission inventory report, That's what I mentioned is required for DEC to issue every year. This is really an overall inventory or estimate of statewide greenhouse gas emissions. It does not always include specific information reported by individual emission sources. So because not all individual sources of greenhouse gas emissions are currently required to report emissions information to DEC, we think that additional information is necessary to support the Cap and Invest program. So we do expect that certain individual emission sources will be required to report emissions to DEC. We think the number of these reporting entities will be greater than the number of entities with an allowance compliance obligation under the Cap and Invest program. We believe this is necessary to support the integrity of emission allowance determinations and really to help identify and inform future regulatory actions under that the state may take in the future. Moving on to the next slide, I want to quickly go over the regulatory framework to implement the inner workings of New York's Cap and Invest program. And by the way, the New York's Cap and Invest program, or NYCI, many of us will refer to that as NYCI, NYCI, New York's Cap and Invest program. That's a shorthand that many of us will continue to use to refer to the program. But DEC and NYSERDA are working to develop 3 parallel regulations to implement the NYCI program. One will be a DEC regulation that will impose mandatory reporting requirements on certain sources of greenhouse gas pollution, as I just mentioned on the previous slide. The second will be a DEC regulation that sets forth the requirements for sources to comply with the Cap and Invest program through providing allowances to DEC to cover their greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, the third will be a NYSERDA regulation that sets forth the details regarding allowance auctions and allowance market participation. So taken together, these 3 regulations will serve to ensure that the state meets the statewide greenhouse gas emission limits established in the Climate Act, and will do so in a manner consistent with the recommendations coming out of the Climate Action Council process and the scoping plan, along with the principles laid out for us by Governor Hochul. So turning to the next slide, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a key distinguishing element of the NYCI program. So other jurisdictions have established Cap and Invest programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Our program in New York is going to be similar, but not identical to many of these other programs. Of course, when we are referring to other similar programs in different jurisdictions, whether that's California, Washington State, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which is a multi-state program of which New York is a key participant. But with any of these programs, we want to keep in mind that we're not referencing these to be exclusive. These are not the only programs that we are considering as we design our NYCI program. But one key distinguishing element of New York's Cap and Invest program compared to all of these other programs is that New York's program is intended to cover all statewide greenhouse gas emissions, all emissions as defined in the Climate Act, as well as in that inventory and in that Part 496 emission limit regulation that I mentioned. So the primary feature that we're considering to ensure that this program is truly economy-wide is the designation of what we call obligated and non-obligated emissions. This is a concept that was initially proposed in the final scoping plan. Chapter 17 of the scoping plan discusses this coming out of that Climate Action Council process. But since this has come up on each of our 5 episodes in our series, we do recognize it is a somewhat new and complex concept. And so we do welcome clarifying questions on this point in particular. And I will spend a little bit of time on it, including with some additional illustrations. So important to emphasize that under NYCI, both emission types, meaning first, so-called obligated emissions, and second, what we refer to as non-obligated emissions, both categories of emissions will be covered by the program. So that's because all emissions must be accounted for under this program and with the NYCI emissions cap. That's going to help ensure that the program is truly economy-wide and that the state meets its greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. So obligated emissions and sources, those entities would have to surrender allowances to us to cover their emissions. That's similar to requirements that we see in other types of emissions trading programs. But because not every single ton of greenhouse gas emissions and every single individual source of such emissions could conceivably have a compliance obligation and therefore be considered an obligated source like this, that's why we need a mechanism for addressing non-obligated emissions. So this category, non-obligated emission sources or sectors, would have their emissions calculated and their allowances retired on their behalf by the state. and emissions that are retired for non-obligated sources would be deducted from the overall cap. In other words, these allowances would be permanently retired and would never be available in the system. Now I'm going to go through a series of cartoons or illustrations that hopefully help to further illustrate this concept. So, because again, we have gotten a fair amount of questions and feedback on this, and this is really a critical component of New York's program. So hopefully these graphics do help to further clarify. So on this first graphic, we wanted to first provide some potential examples of what might be non-obligated sources or categories of emissions. Again, it's important to emphasize that these are illustrative examples only. Like I said at the top, we have not made any determinations regarding which sectors or sources would be obligated versus non-obligated, but some potential examples as illustrated here might include aviation emissions, direct emissions from livestock, or very small individual sources of emissions that are below established thresholds. So for example, an individual homeowner or individual renter would not be expected to have an allowance compliance obligation. Some of these emissions could still be addressed through an obligation on a fuel supplier. Moving on to the next cartoon. So what you see here is that, as I have emphasized, all emissions from all sources economy-wide are covered by the Climate Act and go into the starting cap. So that includes emissions from obligated sources as well as emissions from non-obligated sources. So that starting cap is the sum total of both obligated sources emissions and non-obligated sources emissions. In our next image, non-obligated sources, as the name suggests, these entities would not have an allowance compliance obligation for their emissions under the program. Of course, these entities, as I mentioned, could have an emissions reporting obligation. But instead of having an allowance compliance obligation, each year DEC would be setting aside this bin of allowances in an amount that covers emissions from those non-obligated sources. And as indicated by that red X, that bin of allowances would be permanently retired by the state and thus not available to obligated sources. And the next image hopefully helps to summarize the overall approach here. So first, to determine the annual allowance budget or the maximum amount of emission allowances that are available to obligated sources and entities each year, DEC would first issue a number of allowances equal to emissions cap. So that's step one, and that's the cap on the top of the screen. Second, we would identify the amount of emissions that are associated with non-obligated sources and sectors. That's the bin of allowances to cover non-obligated emissions on the bottom right. Again, as indicated by the red X, this quantity of emission allowances would be permanently retired by DEC and would not be available to obligated sources. Our third step, after this subtraction and retirement of allowances, only the remaining quantity of allowances, the bin on the bottom left, only those allowances would be available to obligated sectors for distribution by auction or otherwise. So while the exact order of these operations has not yet been determined, this represents the conceptual approach. And we do welcome your feedback on this process. So step two in the process, so the part of sort of identifying the amount of allowances that are representing non-obligated emissions, there's a couple of different ways that we could do that. So for example, we could estimate the amount of such emissions. We could utilize reported emissions data. We can incorporate some type of reconciliation or adjustment process. We could utilize some combination of these mechanisms. These are things that we welcome your input on. And finally, the next image here, just to sum up. So non-obligated sources would not have an allowance compliance obligation under NYSERDA, New York Cap and Invest. Non-obligated sources might include aviation, direct emissions from livestock, and emissions from very small individual sources that are below an established emissions threshold. But again, we have not made any final determinations on these issues, and we welcome your input. We would take allowances to cover these non-obligated sources of emissions out of the cap and permanently retire them. So this is hopefully helpful to illustrate this concept, but we do continue to welcome your questions, and we will continue to respond to your feedback in future presentations. So finally, one more slide before I pass it over to the experts. A key principle that I've been highlighting today and in other sessions is making sure that we are benefiting disadvantaged communities. So the law requires that at least 35% of investments benefit disadvantaged communities, and we really are expecting this to equate to significant and much needed financial resources for disadvantaged communities. For example, we know that pollution reduction strategies in disadvantaged communities are being considered as part of an ongoing and parallel effort under the Climate Act, known as the Statewide Community Air Monitoring Initiative. And strategies that are born out of that effort are examples of things that could be funded through this program. But in addition to the investment side of our Cap and Invest program, we are also seeking feedback about any additional regulatory mechanisms that we should consider on the so-called cap side of this program to help ensure that emission reductions occur in disadvantaged communities. While this particular program is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we are also cognizant of co-pollutant emissions. So we want to make sure that this program and other regulatory programs help to reduce emissions in disadvantaged communities. As laid out in the scoping plan, that's chapter 17 again, as I mentioned, in order to maximize one of the key principles, which is affordability, we do anticipate that NYSERDA will include some amount of emission allowance trading, just as we have seen in RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and in other jurisdictions' existing Cap and Invest programs. But the final scoping plan also highlighted potential mechanisms for DEC to consider to help ensure emission reductions in disadvantaged communities. These are mechanisms that are really subject to this ongoing engagement with stakeholders like all of you and with environmental justice and disadvantaged community stakeholders. But some of these potential mechanisms that we're considering, and they're outlined in the scoping plan, include limits on trading of allowances for sources that are located within disadvantaged communities, and also requiring additional allowances for sources that are located within disadvantaged communities. So those are just a couple of examples of things that we are considering with respect to disadvantaged communities, and we do welcome your input on this point as well. Moving on to the next slide, I just want to give a reminder before I hand it over here. The information that's presented today and in past webinars can be reviewed on the website, capandinvest.ny.gov. We will get to substantive questions at the end of this presentation. You might not be able to get to all of them, as I said, but we are always taking comments on that website as well. So I now want to turn it over to Chris Malone, Director of DEC's Division of Air Resources. Chris?
Great, thank you, John. So we've learned that the NYSERDA program is intended to be truly economy-wide. The scope of New York's program will be more encompassing than other jurisdictions. So we're seeking input on what elements of those other jurisdictions' programs can be leveraged for use by New York. While we have been highlighting California Air Resources Board as well as Washington and Quebec programs here, as John noted, this is not intended to be exclusive, as we welcome input on related elements of any and all jurisdictions' programs. New York's greenhouse gas emissions are generated from a variety of sectors and sources, as described in the annual greenhouse gas report. And the decisions made in other jurisdictions may or may not be the best fit for New York's program. There also may be program design elements in each of these other jurisdictions' programs that are universally best practices, and they will work equally well in New York. While today our focus is on landfills, waste combustion, waste exporters, and waste treatment, we welcome feedback through our webpage on all aspects of program development. So on to the next slide. A number of program design decisions are under development, and here we list some of those. I will hit the highlights of each of this on the slide, and then I and subsequent speakers will follow up with in-depth slides on each of these elements. Applicability and threshold will define who and under what emission or operational circumstance the regulations apply. As noted earlier, this may be different for Cap and Invest than for mandatory reporting. Allowance allocation provisions will identify how allowances are created and assigned to accounts, whereas the auction provisions will establish the mechanism for allowances, for how allowances are anticipated to be made available to compliance entities. The cap will establish the number of allowances to cover annual emissions under the program, while the budget will set the number of allowances available for compliance entities. Remember, The cap or the full annual emissions will need to decrease to meet the 2030 and 2050 limits defined in the CLCPA and Part 496. Program stability provisions are mechanisms in which the availability of allowances could change in response to unanticipated events. Compliance and enforcement provisions will describe how and when obligated entities will surrender allowances for their emissions and what happens when they do not comply. And lastly, reporting and verification provisions will establish the emission reporting and verification requirements of the program. And the next slide, talk about cap and invest design elements. So applicability will explain which sources may or may not have to obtain and surrender allowances under the cap and invest program. Thresholds establish when program applies, and this may be determined by emission level or operational criteria. Different applicability and thresholds may apply to different source sectors. Throughout the rest of this presentation, we are trying to remain focused on considerations related to emissions associated with the waste sector. Certain specific examples may be given, but this is not indication that those are the only issues we want to hear from you about. Additional consideration about emissions and operational criteria not specifically identified are welcome. In addition to the general definitions provided here, the state would like feedback on which level to set the applicability of multiple sources. Should it be at the facility level or at every emissions point? Facility level could mean an entire building or plant under contiguous common ownership. Thresholds calculated from combustion would include upstream, out-of-state, process, vented, and fugitive emissions. There are other types of thresholds that may be considered, such as throughput or emissions generation potential from waste stored in a landfill. We are looking for comment on how best to establish thresholds for all sectors. Next slide, we will talk specifically about the waste sector. Emissions are produced from a diverse group of sources in the waste sectors, and these may include, but are not limited to, landfills, exported waste, waste combustion, and wastewater treatment. As we move forward with the development of this program, we'll be looking for feedback on what applicability should be applied to landfills. For instance, how might the landfill type, whether it be municipal waste, construction and demolition debris, landfill clearing, industrial or hazardous waste landfill, how might that landfill type be included in the program? What considerations should be used to account for emissions due to waste exported to other states? How might waste transfer stations and direct haulers be part of the program? What considerations should inform the compliance requirements for waste combustion facilities? And how should applicability for wastewater treatment facilities be structured? Should the presence of anaerobic digesters or other treatment systems be a determining factor? What should be considered when evaluating if the fuel utilized at a wastewater treatment facility should be covered by the fuel supplier rather than a treatment facility as a stationary source? And when considering thresholds, should emission generation potential be the primary consideration? So could landfill capacity, combustion facility throughput, annual waste transfer tonnage, or population served by a treatment facility serve as a reasonable proxy for emission generation potential? Or should other threshold metrics be evaluated? Next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about fuel suppliers. So while this presentation is focused on emissions associated with waste managing facilities, the state understands that there is a connection between these facilities and fuel supply. Because of this, we'd like to spend some time on what that connection to make most informed decisions in the development of NYSERDA. Fuel suppliers are anticipated to have allowance obligations for all non-aviation fuel delivered to end users in the state. It is anticipated that these allowance obligations would be for both combustion emissions and for upstream out-of-state emissions from the production and delivery of that fuel. The compliance obligations for fuel associated with a waste managing facility may be covered by those facilities rather than by the fuel suppliers. This may be due to the facility being the first owner of the fuel within the state. Additionally, what should be considered when establishing emission allowance obligations for the fuel supplier or at a waste management facility for fuel utilized by that facility? What should be considered when structuring applicability so that the obligation for fuel consumed at a facility is clear to both the facility and the fuel supplier? What tracking and reporting characteristics and systems exist to identify the fuel supplier and facility fuel ownership? And lastly, what should be considered when assigning emissions associated with the use of biogas or renewable natural gas produced at a landfill or anaerobic digester? And lastly, as a reminder, next slide, the information presented today and past webinars can be reviewed on the website. Questions of substance are planned to be answered at the end of the presentation. And while we may not be able to get all the questions, we are taking comments on the website. Thank you. I would now like to turn over to Mike Sheehan. He is the director of the Air Quality Planning Bureau and DEC's Division of Air Resources. Mike will describe some of our starting points for consideration and describe some of our key program design decisions. Mike.
Thank you. I will continue the more detailed discussions started by Chris by first discussing allocation of allowances. Once we have established the compliance obligations or determined applicability and set thresholds, we will need to determine how to allocate allowances under the program. Before an allowance can be turned in for compliance, the allowances must be generated by the state and distributed to the market. We anticipate the primary mechanism for allowance distribution under NICI will be through auction. In addition, set-asides may be established for the distribution of allowances to EITE sources and separate set-asides established to support allowance retirement by the state for non-obligated sources. As explained earlier, and to clarify some questions we received during our initial webinars, retirement means allowances are permanently deducted and never again available in the marketplace to cover emissions. The total allowances generated by the state in a year is anticipated to equal the cap. What we're looking for feedback on is should other methods of allowance distribution be considered under the program. On this next slide, I will discuss the allowance cap. The allowance cap establishes the overall limitations of the program and will be designed to align with the Climate Act emission limits in 2030 and 2050. In setting these limitations, we will need to determine the starting year and starting cap level of the program. As mentioned earlier, the current greenhouse gas inventory is generally published 2 years after the end of the inventory year. The last year of inventory release 2020 was published in 2022. Should this information be used to set the starting cap at the most recent inventory emissions? Should an average of emissions over multiple years should be used, or should the cap be informed by available data trends or analysis? What should be considered when setting the starting cap and trajectory to account for emissions from landfills, waste combustion, waste exporters, and wastewater treatment facilities? In determining the cap decline from that starting point to the Climate Act emissions limits, should we consider a linear trajectory as shown in an earlier slide, or should reductions be aligned with a step down period that might reflect the timing of other emission reduction strategies? This next slide will serve as a refresher on non-obligated sources. As mentioned earlier, to ensure this program is truly economy-wide and to ensure achievement of the Climate Act's statewide emissions limits, in addition to obligated sectors and the associated requirements mentioned above, the state will need to retire allowances for all non-obligated emission sources and sectors. Ensuring that these emissions are estimated accurately is important. To address non-obligated emissions, the state is considering the establishment of a set-aside or set-asides that would include calculation methods in addition to language on how and when the allowances for non-obligated emissions are to be retired. To reiterate, retired allowances are permanently deducted from the system and not available for obligated sources to cover emissions. It is anticipated that emissions calculation methods for non-obligated sources would be aligned with the methods in the greenhouse gas inventory or be informed by state-specific reporting. The set-asides may need to be established well in advance of actual activity data information used to calculate emissions based on the best available inventory data. To better inform the creation of the set-aside, we are looking for feedback on how the set-aside should be designed, whether there should be mechanisms to adjust the number of allowances based on annual data, and what data should inform these adjustments. In addition, if non-obligated emissions are larger or smaller than the set-aside in any year or series of years, where should additional allowances come from or flow to, if at all? Lastly, what consideration should there be on timing the retirement of non-obligated emissions compared to the compliance deadlines for obligated emissions? On this next slide, we'll look again at the term budget. As noted earlier in the presentation, the allowance budget set the number of allowances available for compliance entities. It represents the total available number of allowances for sources to acquire at auction or direct allocation from a set-aside. Non-obligated allowances, while covered under the economy-wide cap, would not be part of the allowance budget. These allowances would be retired by the state and come out from under the cap. The annual cap is the sum of non-obligated allowances plus the allowance budget in any year. In this next slide, I want to take some time to introduce the concept of program stability mechanisms. Program stability mechanisms could be incorporated into the program to add or remove allowances under certain market conditions and used to establish criteria for the holding of those allowances. A cost containment reserve, if established, could be designed to provide additional allowances at an auction if the price becomes higher than anticipated. What information should be used in the determination of the price that additional allowances become available? Where should these allowances come from? A tranche of allowances under the cap? From future years? Should there be multiple price tiers? What information should be used to determine how large a CCR could be? Should it be a percentage of the cap or budget, a modeled amount to meet a specific price point? An ECR, or an emissions containment reserve, if established, would withdraw a number of allowances at an auction if the price fell below a specific value. What should inform the determination of this price point? Should the ECR be the same size as the CCR? Should the design mirror the design of the CCR? Banking refers to retainage of allowances by market participants beyond the near-term compliance needs. There may be a variety of economic or planning decision sources or market participants take to decide if they maintain a bank of allowances. What information should the state consider when determining the impact of banking? A banking adjustment could remove allowances from future auctions. Should a banking adjustment be considered? If so, what considerations should go into establishing a banking adjustment? What should trigger that banking adjustment? On this next slide, I will touch on the compliance process. Compliance under a cap and invest program refers to the surrendering of allowances for retirement for each ton of emissions from a source. Multi-year compliance period may offer flexibility to sources needing to acquire allowances to cover emissions fluctuations when compared to a single year compliance period. In this example, at the end of a multi-year compliance period, all 3 years worth of emissions would have to be covered by allowances at the end of the third year. An option to consider, similar to RGGI, is that during the preceding 2 years of a 3-year compliance period, part of the emissions would have to be covered and what is called an interim year compliance obligation. If a multi-year compliance periods are utilized, what percent of emissions should have a compliance obligation in the interim years? What information should we consider when establishing the compliance date? Should the compliance date be the same for all emission sources? Should any consideration be given to the timing the compliance date in auctions? Is there a need for substantial time between reporting deadlines on the compliance deadline? I will conclude my portion of the presentation by asking you some additional questions about enforcement mechanisms under the program. Enforcement and penalties are key components of any regulatory program and would be utilized in a cap and invest context when a source fails to surrender the necessary number of allowances to cover their emissions. What should be considered when establishing penalties for this program? Should monetary and the surrender of additional allowances be considered as penalties? How might these different types of penalties be structured? Onto our reminder slide. Before I turn the presentation over to Nathan Putnam, professional engineer in the Bureau of Air Quality Planning and DEC's Division of Air Resources, to describe some of our starting points for consideration and describe some of our key program design decisions, I want to remind our audience that the information presented today and in past webinars can be found on the Cap and Invest website. Nathan?
Thank you. So we start off with the reporting design elements. Again, this will be what becomes part 253, but similar to the Cap and Invest regulation described earlier, applicability and thresholds will also need to be established for entities which are subject to the greenhouse gas reporting requirements. The reporting regulation is expected to include robust description of all emission factors and activity data requirements for all reporting entities. Reported emissions and activity data are anticipated to be used to establish emissions for compliance with the Cap and Invest regulation. Reporting may also support the calculation of non-obligated emissions and improvements to the statewide greenhouse gas inventory. The applicability and thresholds for reporting may be different than those of the Cap and Invest regulation, and there may be entities that have reporting requirements but have no allowance requirements. As a reminder, an emissions threshold is compared to the annual greenhouse gas emissions from an emission source. If the emissions at the source exceed the threshold, then that source is required to report. An operational threshold will be based on an annual production or utilization amount in a specific time period, such as the number of widgets produced in a year. Waste-related emission sectors are highlighted in this presentation, but this does not indicate that they are the only emission sectors which are anticipated to have reporting requirements. Next slide, please. What should be considered when establishing reporting requirements, and what, if any, emissions information or activity data can be extracted or leveraged from other existing regulatory programs? What should the state consider when evaluating whether to develop plain language requirements within this regulation compared to incorporating by reference another program's reporting requirements? What should be considered when determining fuel supplier reporting requirements to inform waste managing facility emissions calculations? What should be considered when establishing how often sources report emissions and whether all sources have the same reporting schedule? Third-party verification of emissions reports and activity data may be required for most or all sources. What should be considered when setting of verification requirements? How might thresholds or compliance with the Cap and Invest regulation be used to determine verification requirements? How often should emissions reports and activity data be verified? And what considerations should inform the establishment of verification timing? What steps should be taken to ensure emission verifiers understand the requirements of the NICI program and have the capacity to responsibly verify emissions? Should verification training be provided, or is an application for accreditation sufficient mechanism to indicate verifiers understand program requirements? What specific considerations should inform the timing of verification for waste management facilities? Next slide, please. In order to properly identify emissions from landfills and waste exporters, how might existing reporting, including the U.S. Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, be leveraged to support the New York State reporting regulation? What enhancements to these existing requirements should be considered to ensure facilities are reporting the most accurate and useful information? How should New York consider the proposed changes to the U.S. Greenhouse Gas Reporting Regulation currently being evaluated for landfills? Greenhouse gas emissions from landfill waste are related to the organic content of the waste. How might the organic fraction of waste be determined by the landfill operator, transfer station, or waste hauler? How should local organics diversion programs be considered when establishing emission factors for waste disposed of in landfills? Besides municipal solid waste landfills, what other types of landfills should be considered for reporting requirements? These could include construction and demolition waste, land clearing debris, hazardous waste landfills, and ash landfills, among others. If these non-municipal solid waste landfills are covered by this regulations, what considerations should be given to establishing thresholds? Should thresholds be the same for all landfill types? What consideration should be evaluated for composting or standalone digester facilities? How might these facilities have special considerations for thresholds or applicability? What should be considered when evaluating reporting requirements for waste hauled to an out-of-state destination? What existing reporting systems can be leveraged to support reporting for this exported waste? How might transfer stations and direct haulers identify their waste characteristics and report emissions based on the destination of the hauled waste? What reporting should be considered for waste combustion facilities? How might reporting of waste characteristics and emissions monitoring better inform program decisions? Next slide. What should be considered when establishing reporting requirements for wastewater treatment facilities? How might the presence of anaerobic digesters and other treatment infrastructure inform the reporting requirements of a facility? What consideration should be given to facilities that treat only sewage rather than combined sewage and stormwater? How might provisions to track the off-site utilization of digester gas be incorporated into the treatment facility reporting? When establishing thresholds for reporting, what consideration should be given to population served or flow rate design capacity of a treatment facility? Next slide, please. How should fuel suppliers identify emissions associated with waste managing facilities? What considerations should be given to having both the facility and fuel supplier report emissions and activity data related to fuel utilization and supply? The majority of fuels used by landfills and wastewater treatment facilities are anticipated to be natural gas and distillate fuels. What should be considered when establishing requirements for fuel suppliers to identify deliveries of these fuels? And what existing reporting system might be evaluated to establish reporting requirements which show the connection between the fuel supplier and the facility? What considerations should be addressed in developing emission factors for upstream out-of-state emissions related to the extraction and transmission of fossil fuels utilized in New York, so that the waste management facility can clearly estimate emissions? How might these emission factors be informed by fuel supplier reporting? What considerations should inform the setting of reporting deadlines? And what amount of time should be given for reporting deadlines to allow informed decisions about allowance compliance? How might these considerations about fuel suppliers apply to the timing of the requirements for waste managing facilities? Next slide. As previously mentioned, the state is reviewing existing cap and invest and greenhouse gas emissions reporting programs in other jurisdictions. Highlighting the California reporting regulation does not indicate a preference for its regulatory text. There may be helpful points of reference within the California reporting rule or other reporting rules to consider for the NYSERDA program. The California reporting rule contains reporting requirements for industrial landfills and industrial wastewater treatment facilities. What should be considered when reviewing these definitions, applicability, thresholds, and other provisions to help design the NYSERDA program? What other programs in California or other jurisdictions should be evaluated to inform the design of New York's reporting requirements? What are the best steps to establish reporting for waste managing facilities in New York? Thank you. Now, I would now like to turn it over to Sarah Osgood, Executive Director of the Climate Action Council, NYSERDA, who will help facilitate our Q&A portion. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Nathan. So as we've done in prior webinars, we're trying to organize these questions a bit by who we've assigned to answer them. So first up, if I could ask Jonathan Binder to be prepared, we've got several questions for you. We have a general question about the process. How are we envisioning the difference between the first round of pre-proposal stakeholder outreach and the subsequent second round? Is the goal to have more specific questions or a more specific vision of the program for this second stage?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks for the question. It's a good question. We are anticipating having more details about potential program design elements at the second phase of the process. We do expect there to be some more detailed questions at that phase as well. So during the second round of pre-proposal outreach, we do expect to be further along in the process of making these types of determinations, but still we will not have made final decisions because that is dependent upon the regulatory process.
Thank you, John. Next question for you. If New York creates special requirements for disadvantaged communities, how will we evaluate the consumer affordability and system reliability impacts that could be created?
Thanks. So all of the impacts from our rulemakings, meaning the cap and invest program and the various three regulations that I described, those will be analyzed and included in the supporting documents that will be released as part of a formal draft proposal for these regulations. I should also emphasize that the state is going to be looking at affordability as part of that climate affordability study process that I mentioned in the beginning. So that study is going to be looking at recommendations for the use of the roughly 30% of NYSERDA proceeds that will be in the Consumer Climate Action Account and going directly back to stakeholders.
Thank you, John. One final one for you for right now. We're having a question, several questions actually, on the feedback timeline. We've asked for feedback by July 1, and someone has pointed out that it's a Saturday of a holiday weekend, and so questioning the firmness of that date and potential for an extension.
Yeah, good question, and we've been hearing this a lot. So, like you said, so thanks for asking. July 1st is not a hard deadline. It's not a formal regulatory deadline. Submissions by July 1st are encouraged because we know that submissions by that date will be most useful for us at this stage of the regulatory process and as we go on to the next phase of pre-proposal outreach. But again, it's very much not a hard deadline. So comments will continue to be accepted at any time. And those comments will continue to influence the development of the NYSERDA program. So even beyond the July 1st deadline, you can still go to capandinvest.ny.gov and provide comments.
Thank you, John. Now moving on, we've got several questions for Chris Lalonde. The first one, can you draw a clear distinction between Part 253 and Part 252?
Sure. So Part 252 will be the cap and invest regulations. So that includes the obligations and the requirement to obtain allowances. And then Part 253 will be the reporting rule that allows us to get the greenhouse gas emissions information. Additionally, NYSERDA will also be promulgating a rule governing the auctions and the proceeds investments.
Great. We've got a question here on kind of the obligated entities. The question is, the speakers are referring to non-obligated sources, non-obligated emissions, and non-obligated sectors. Are there distinctions? And for example, how would you describe emissions from a private residence burning natural gas that is the responsibility of the fuel supplier and not the resident?
Sure. So I'll give you try an example. So waste is being considered as an obligated sector, and the specific entities that must obtain allowances for their waste related emissions, such as a wastewater treatment plant, would be obligated sources, and the emissions that they're required to obtain and surrender allowances for are their obligated emissions. In the example that was asked about emissions associated with the combustion of natural gas in the home, for which the utility is responsible, are the obligated emissions.
Thank you, Chris. That looks like all we've got for you for right now.
Right, thanks.
Moving on to Mike Sheehan. Will certain industries that impact public safety, for example, hospitals or electric generation, have allowance priority over other sectors if allowance scarcity is a concern?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. We're seeking feedback on how to handle hospitals. It's anticipated that many hospitals may be non-obligated, as they may be below applicability emission thresholds that we're considering for the program. For larger hospitals that may ultimately be obligated, we seek feedback on how and if to handle them. We're also seeking feedback on whether electricity sources currently subject to RGGI should be obligated or non-obligated. We have not made a determination at this point if RGGI sources are ultimately obligated. One option we are considering would be crediting any RGGI allowance price already paid against any NICI allowance price. We do not anticipate providing any sector priority over another sector for purchasing or acquiring allowances through the auction.
Thank you, Mike. Can you also clarify what's meant by allowances? Does it refer to entities purchasing credits as opposed to the actual emissions reductions?
Yep. In order to meet a ton, in order to emit a ton of greenhouse gases, and an obligated entity needs to hold and surrender an allowance for each ton they emit. The amount of allowances New York issues will decline each year, ensuring that total allowable emissions declines in accordance with the Climate Act targets.
And final one for you, Mike. Is New York State planning to buy allowances in the auction to cover non-obligated emissions and then pass the cost of that through the budget process?
DEC will identify emissions associated with obligated sector emissions and retire them before selling those allowances to the market. So basically, it will just be a process established in regulation. There wouldn't be a purchase aspect to that.
Mike, can I just ask, I think I might have heard you wrong, but just to verify, you said you'd identify the emissions associated with non-obligated or obligated?
Correct, non-obligated.
Non-obligated, great, thank you. And thank you, Mike. That was it for the questions for you. Nathan, we've got one for you. If capital investment is required to reduce emissions at a wastewater treatment facility, does NYSERDA or DEC intend to include emissions associated with the construction fuel consumption, would temporary or minor construction be a potential candidate for a non-obligated source?
Yeah, great question. All emissions would be considered within NICI's targets. So all emissions would be covered by the program, including emissions associated with construction. The exact choices on what is not obligated and what is obligated have not been finalized. So we're seeking input on how to split those emissions.
Great, thank you, Nathan. Let me just check to make sure we don't have, I think we've got a couple other ones. Please bear with me for a second. Jonathan, one for you. How will non-obligated entities be incentivized to reduce their emissions since these allowances will be provided to them?
Thanks for the question. So first, just to clarify, the allowances would not be provided to non-obligated entities, but we would be retiring allowances on behalf of those emissions. But it's important to recognize that the scoping plan really recommended that the NICI program, Cap and Invest, be just part of our path to achieve the state's requirements, not the sole element of achieving the emission limits as set forth in the Climate Act. We do expect that revenue that comes in from this program through the auction of allowance proceeds will be invested in various efforts to help decarbonize the economy, including for both the benefit of obligated and non-obligated emissions. So that's another way that we will be getting at these non-obligated emissions. And finally, as acknowledged by the scoping plan, there would be other potential complementary regulations and policies as well to address emissions from the non-obligated sectors, in addition to just the Cap and Invest program.
Great, thank you, John. And I think we've got our last question here also for you. Would an obligated source buy allowances for their electricity, or would the electricity suppliers do that?
I mean, so first of all, generally speaking, as I think Mike answered for the question about electricity, we're generally seeking feedback on whether or not the electricity sector would be covered, recognizing that right now these sources are covered by the RGGI program. If electricity is ultimately an obligated sector, we would expect that the allowance compliance obligation would fall on the electricity sector itself, meaning the generator or the supplier of electricity, and not on the users or consumers of electricity. That's the same way and analogous to what we would expect for fuel, in the sense that we would expect the fuel suppliers to have an allowance compliance obligation and not consumers of such fuel. But again, something that we're seeking feedback on along with all of these items.
Thank you, John. And with that, I'll now hand it over to Joe Berman, Senior Advisor of Strategic Partnerships at NYSERDA, to close us out with some reminder information. Joe?
All right, thanks so much, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Sarah said, my name is Joe Berman, and I'm the Senior Advisor of Strategic Partnerships for NYSERDA. This brings us to the end of what we wanted to present here today. So we shared this timeline at the top of the webinar, but wanted to show it again as a reminder of the process before us. This was the fifth in a series of webinars to outline potential elements of New York's Cap and Invest program and identify specific areas where stakeholder feedback would be especially valuable. We're planning 2 rounds of pre-proposal outreach. Input received in this first phase of outreach and engagement will be used to inform development of a draft regulatory proposal. We'll then seek a second round of feedback prior to formally issuing the draft regulatory proposal for formal public input. The formal public comment period will include public hearings and additional opportunities for stakeholder input. Final regulations would address the formal public comments. Following finalization of the regulations, mandatory reporting compliance and allowance auctions would begin. If you could move the slide, please. All right, so as I said, this is the fifth webinar rather in the series of 7 we'll be holding this month to help prompt feedback on program design elements that the state should consider in development of these regulations. Please join us again on June 20th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. for our next webinar on cap and invest analysis inputs and methods. It's been said many times over the course of this event, but I think it's important to mention again, all of these webinars will be recorded and posted to the capandinvest.ny.gov website. Any additional events will also be posted to that website as well. If you could move the slide, please. So in terms of providing feedback, I'd like to reiterate that while we may not have answered all of the questions today, for those that have asked whether decisions have been made on any aspects of the program, those decisions have not yet been made, and we are following direction from the Scoping Plan Chapter 17 and the Governor's Principles. Again, we encourage you to provide feedback to inform the regulations development, and you can do so by heading over to capandinvest.ny.gov and look for the Submit Comments button. We are accepting comments at any time, but would appreciate feedback on this initial set of questions by July 1st so that the team can evaluate the feedback and when developing the next phase of pre-proposal materials. As a reminder, details for future webinars and recordings of past webinars can be found on the meetings and events page of the CAP and Invest website. If you could move the slide, please. So now we want to take a minute to walk you through the process of submitting comments to the CAP and Invest website. Here is a screenshot of the CAP and Invest website. To submit comments and review questions posed by NYSERDA and DEC, please click on CAP and Invest rule at the top of the page. There you'll find information on the CAP and Invest rulemaking process, and about halfway down the page is the Submit Comments button. Also on this page is a PDF commenting form that you can download. This form has fillable fields organized by the major topic headings for which we're seeking your feedback. You can use this form to help organize your comments. The Submit Comments button and the PDF commenting form are available on every page of the CAP and Invest website. And to submit comments, click on the Submit Comments button and you'll be directed to the comment management platform where you can directly enter comments or upload attachments that contain your comments. If you could advance the slide, please. Further down on the same page, you'll find the high-level question topics in the dark blue boxes as shown here in the image on the left. Clicking on the plus sign button in the bottom right corner of the box will expand the boxes shown in the image on the right to provide you with a list of questions that we're seeking your feedback on. Please note that this accordion menu will be expanded with the additional questions that have been posed by the presenters this week and will continue to be updated with additional questions as we progress through the webinar series in phase 1. In order to aid you in developing your comments, we're compiling a comprehensive list of all the questions posed on the website, the presentation slides, and verbally during our webinar series. This will also be posted to the website soon and updated as the series progresses. If you could advance the slide, please. So you can also you can also submit written feedback to the mailing address on the screen. You can send that to Bureau of Air Quality Planning, New York State DEC, Division of Air Resources, 625 Broadway, Albany, New York, 12233. If you could advance the slide, please. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us for this event, and we hope to see you for future New York CAP and Invest webinars. Thank you.